Storm, and I'm one of the many people connected with Court 250 who you'll meet today. And we are so pleased to have you here this morning and to have this chance to get to know you this semester. So welcome to Court 250. You may notice by now that the Blackboard site is up and running, and we've got a few things posted up there already. We'll hear a little bit more about course details later on today. One of the first things we want to make sure you know is you may wonder why you're getting a sheet that comes by you that has your name on it. What we're asking you to do just for the first few days of class is initial by your name. We won't take attendance all semester. We hope that you will find the ideas of the class invigorating and that you'll want to be here, and we'll take responsibility for that, so we will not take attendance all term. But for the first few days of class, we will, because we need to confirm with the registrar's office who's actually here. So you will find that sheet going around, and please initial it and keep it going. And again, we'll look forward to meeting you this term. I have extended family that lived for a long time in Texas. They had this big ranch outside of San Antonio. And actually, they don't own it anymore. I think they sold it to one of the Dixie Chicks, but nonetheless, it belonged to us. And I used to go when I was a child and find on this ranch this big cedar chest. And in that chest, there were all of these newspaper clippings and photos and diaries and love letters and things that had been part of my family's past. And by looking at those pieces of my family's past, I began to get a better understanding of not only who my family had been, but in some ways who I was, because they were part of me. We think of Court 250 as being like our intellectual cedar chest. We're going to explore people and ideas of the past in the West who continue to be important today, whose ideas continue to influence the way people think about things, the way political debates happen. And we hope that what you will find this semester is that not only are you introduced to a lot of interesting people and interesting ideas, but that you get to know yourself better too through all of this. So welcome to Court 250. We look forward to getting to know you. Now what I'd like to do is to make sure you get to meet all of the people who are part of CORE. And part of that is you. We won't do all those introductions today. We'll save some of those for debriefs. But at the very least, I would like for the people who are part of the instructional team, the teaching team, to come up and introduce themselves, or if they've got a really loud voice, they can stand wherever they are and tell you their names. But I'd like for them to tell you their name, where they work on campus, just so you can begin to get a sense of who's part of this class. So I will start with Leonard the Legend.
My name is Leonard Oakland. I teach in the English department, teach literature and film, and I've been teaching Court 250 since before your parents were born.
I'm Mary Chichu. I teach in the art department. I teach the art history classes, and I'm in my 7th year teaching court.
I'm Forrest Barrett. I teach philosophy, and this is the 115th time I've taught this course.
My name is Ross Brooke Watts. I'm the Director of the Center for Service Learning and Community Engagement, formerly of the History Department, and I think I've been doing this for about 5 years.
And I'm Andrew Parrish. I'm in Educational Support Services in the Hub Second Floor of Career Services, and I think I've been doing Court 250 about 4 years.
Are Matthew and Mindy available?
Yeah, I'm Matthew. I'm in Residence Life, RD and BMAC. This is my second time through this course.
I'm Mindy Smith. I'm a campus pastor here, work over in the chapel, and then the course coordinator here.
How many of you here have a cell phone? How many of you do not have a cell phone? Oh, we haven't changed this semester.
It has cellular technology. You open it up and you can talk on it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that, back in the late 80s. What has technology done to all of us? You, young people, and us, myself and the dinosaurs. This experience of going from a landline to a phone in your pocket. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book called Fame. You speak out of nowhere. You could be anywhere. And because nothing can be checked, anything you choose to imagine is at the bottom true. If no one can prove to me where I am, if I myself am not absolutely certain, where is the court that can adjudicate these things? We who now live in this digital age have very vividly presented to us a problem. The problem goes back to Plato and Aristotle. It's not a new problem. But it comes to us in a dramatic new fashion of where are you? I mean, when I was your age and I called a friend, I knew exactly where he or she was standing because the phone was on the wall, the phone was on the kitchen table, whatever it was. Now, one of my first questions is, where are you? And that's one of the underlying questions of this course. How strange that technology has brought us into a world where there are no fixed places anymore. So, if you're talking on your phone, you could be in Liberia, you could be in Spokane, you could be in Vladivostok. Kathy used a wonderful metaphor for what we do in Court 250. She talked about the cedar chest, the family chest. I want to use another metaphor to complement that, and that each of us is a tree. And what this course is about is roots. What are the roots of ourselves and our knowing? And we're going to look at those roots. We're going to put names to a lot of ideas you have in your heads. We're also going to challenge you, challenge all of us, the team as well as the students, with this conflict of ideas. So, we'll go after our collective roots. The core program, most of you have been to Core 150, but for those of you who haven't, this course does not presuppose the knowledge of 150. It is independent. But in Core 150, it states the claims of what we affirm, largely in faith, but some of it in knowledge of what's real. In this course, we ask how you justify claims. Our key question for the whole semester is, how do you know? Not what you know. Yes, we'll talk plenty about that. But how do you know? And how do we trust what you know? And in Core 350 sets out to apply those claims. How do we respond and act in response to what we affirm? A few things I want to say about being in this room and being in this course. Most days, every day from now on, there will be a lecture outline available to you 24 hours in advance, or at least by 5 p.m. the night before a lecture. And you can print it out and bring it to class. We will not distribute lecture outlines in here, but every lecture has an outline. When we come to our 4 exams of our 4 units, we will have a review offered in the discussion room. Now, there may be other reviews that are announced, but basically the review is conducted in the discussion room on Tuesday. Tutoring will be available, and Andrew will have a little bit more to say about tutoring. Andrew?
Right here.
You want to say that?
Sure, you bet. Tutoring, it'll start next week. We'll be on, and we'll put this on Blackboard so you can access it. But it'll be Mondays and Thursday evenings from 6 to 9 over in Lindeman 206. They'll be posted accommodations in the class academic accommodations on campus. So if any of you need an accommodation, whether you need materials in alternate format, or if you need extended time for exams and alternate test site because of the documented condition, not just important in any of your classes, I'm the person to see on that. And my contact information is on the syllabus. Thanks.
And we're expecting you'll have a copy of the syllabus by the end of this hour. Something we do expect to hand out, but it's on its way. So, two more items on this slide. We invite you to bring laptops. We're the only corps that invites laptops, as I think you know. But with this concern, we ask anyone who's bringing a laptop to sit in this area over here, so that all the laptops are over here. One of the problems with laptops is that students, and we ask you very briefly, always to have your laptop tuned to the Core 250 outline for today, and to nothing else. If there's something else, we will ask you to cease bringing your laptop. Also, laptops are disturbing to people behind you, which is why we all ask them to be grouped over here. Finally, on this slide, this is the living room of the campus. This furniture is breakable. Oh, this chair got fixed this year, but they're easy to break. Please do not ever step over a chair onto the seat in front of you. Please do not put your feet up on the back of the seat in front of you. Also, if you bring anything here to either drink, we ask you not to eat, and certainly not to bring anything that smells like McDonald's fries. And all beverages should be covered. The doors make a lot of noise. If you have to leave during the session, we ask you to treat the doors very quiet. We have 4 goals announced for the core program. The 4th one particularly for this. Knowledge goal, these come out of the college catalog. We are looking at worldviews in the Western rationalist tradition. You don't need to write until a little later in the hour. Secondly, skills. We emphasize critical thinking in this course. And with that, writing skills in that act of thinking. But thinking is our emphasis. We're looking for you to have increased sophistication in your ability to analyze. And that is something that we emphasize in here. Faith and values. We want you to be able to articulate your own worldview. We want you to challenge and to undergird your present commitments. Some of it will be challenged, some of it will be undergirded, those commitments. And 4th, particularly for Core 250, and especially this semester, we want to talk about diversity. And we tend to use that word in a very narrow sense in our general conversation. But in here, it has a broad sense. So we want to look at diversity that exists within our Whitworth community. We want to see what exists within the Western intellectual tradition, which is our main topic. And we want to look at issues of justice and fairness and injustice and unfairness, whether that comes from race or class or gender, those things that have affected us so greatly. Force bigger.
Okay. All right, so now we're moving to the outline. You will need your outline. If you didn't bring one, you can always get those on Blackboard. If not, you can just take notes in general. Let me just add my word about this room. First off, all of the sound out there is funneled down to here. So if you're talking to someone, particularly at the end of a lecture, if you're kind of chit-chatting, we hear all of it. This is why we have to be mic'd, because the sound doesn't go from here to there. It goes from there to here. So please be aware of that. And also, that chair in front of you is just the right height for putting your feet up. I mean, it's just perfect for putting your feet up and getting comfortable. please don't. I know it's kind of a pain. There are two exceptions to that. I see that no one is sitting in that seat right there, which has a metal bar in front of it, and you're welcome to put your feet up there. Or this seat right here, which you have the good sense to choose, and you may put your feet up on that one. But that one you have to turn kind of sideways to do it. That's the best seat in the house right there. Okay. We have 5 basic questions we're going to be looking at in here. And 2 of these are ones you're used to, 3 of them are not. First, how should I live as an individual? How should I live my life? What's important? This is what field we know as ethics. What's the right thing to do? How should I live? But of course, we're not just individuals. We also have to ask, how should we live as a community? And that's the area we know as politics. Politics is not just Republican and Democrat. It's all the interactions we do as a group. Okay. Those are the 2 areas where you have had many discussions with your friends. You've talked about these issues late at night. I'm assuming this is easy to get a discussion going on these 2. But we would argue in here that your answers to those 2 are based on these 3. Namely, what is really real? Before you can answer the question of what you should do, either individually or collectively, you have to know what reality is. What is really real? This is the field we call metaphysics. And of course, there's a subdivision of that which asks, well, who am I? What's really real about me? And this is the field we know as anthropology. So for instance, imagine that I'm a pregnant woman, okay? That's your imagination. Now, what is this? Yeah, well, you get a lot of different answers to that, can't you? In fact, even the words I use to describe this will probably tell you where I fall on an ethical and political issue. If I call it an unborn child, you've got a pretty good idea where I stand on a particular ethical and political issue. If I say it's a fetus, not quite as clear. If I say it's a piece of tissue, now you've got a pretty good idea where I stand on a political and ethical issue. It's the opposite of the first one. What you even call that is going to make all the difference in the world. What is it really? Who are we? What is really real? But behind all of these is the question that Leonard already mentioned we're going to be asking in here, which is, how do you know? And that's the most important one we would argue. That's the key question we're going to ask in here. Because as soon as I say this is an unborn child and therefore has a right to life, etc., you're going to say, how do you know that? And I'm going to appeal to scripture or authority, wherever I'm going to go. Or if you say, well, it's a piece of tissue, well, what am I going to appeal to there? How do I know that? That's going to be the key question. So let's focus in on that. What is epistemology? It's not what you know, but how you know it. So let's talk about the sources and justifications for knowledge. And we're going to lay out 4 of them. And you have these briefly in Core 150. We're going to go a little more in depth here. But first, let's give a traditional definition of knowledge. And the traditional definition says, well, first, in order to know something, you have to have a belief. You have to believe that something is true. You can't know what you don't believe. And we all have those, of course. We all have beliefs. But, of course, believing something doesn't make it knowledge unless it's true. I can believe that, the moon is made of green cheese. Maybe I actually believe that. But I can't say I know it unless it's true. And, of course, that isn't true. So, true knowledge. It has to have truth as well as being belief in order to be knowledge. You can't know what is not the case. So, let's try it right here. Here we go. Heads or tails? Heads. It is heads. Very good. You knew it was heads, didn't you? Did he know that before I lifted my hand? He believed it was heads, and he was right that it was heads. So isn't that knowledge? No, why not? Good, good. He didn't have a reason for it, did he? It was just a lucky guess. And by the way, if he had guessed and it was wrong, I would have just done it again until somebody got it right. This guy you want to go gambling with right here. That's because it's not enough just to believe something and for it to be true. You might just be lucky. You have to have a justification for it. It has to be justified true belief, and that's the big issue. What justifies your true belief? The fact that you got lucky doesn't mean you know something. There has to be a reason for it. This is the traditional definition of knowledge, justified true belief. So the two, I'll put that for another second there. So the two big questions we're going to be asking right now are, number one, what are the sources of knowledge? Where do we get our information from? And we're going to lay out 4 possibilities. And then secondly, once we have that information, how do we justify it? How do we justify that information? So, justified true belief. That's the traditional definition of knowledge. By the way, I keep saying the traditional definition because there are some odd little samples that work in other ways. And if you're interested in pursuing this further, you can take epistemology from my colleague Josh Orozco, and he'll give you all kinds of interesting exceptions. But we're looking at the big picture. Okay, so what is the source of knowledge, and what's the justification of those sources? And we have 4 of them we're going to talk about, starting with authoritarianism.
Authoritarianism. Here we go without my glasses. Let's see what happens. Without the clicker. Better. Okay, authoritarianism. Well, what in the world is going on in Ukraine, in Gaza? What's going on in Syria and Iraq under the brutal influence of ISIS? What is happening in those parts of the world? Or how many planets are there? Are there 8 or are there 9? Does Pluto count? Well, those are all things that we cannot know unless we've got the benefit of an authority. So here's what authoritarianism is. Authoritarianism is knowledge that comes from an authority, which could be a person or could be a text. Who are the people who are your authorities? Maybe parents or teachers or friends, youth group leaders, pastors, John Stewart, whoever your authorities are, they count here. Or textbooks, books, magazines, newspapers, Wikipedia, all those things count as authorities. Authoritarianism is knowledge that comes from an external source, some source outside of ourselves. Again, could be a person, could be a text, but somehow we're relying on others. Some examples of authoritarianism. Well, we all know that the dish on the left is breakfast, the dish on the right is not, at least until you get to college, in which case Snickers is pretty balanced, doesn't it? But for the most part, we know which is the breakfast food. Where did we find out that information? It came from an authority. I took some medicine this morning. Why did I take it? Not because the pills were a pretty color, but because an authority had told me that that would be a good idea and that that would help me. Or yesterday I walked outside of this room. I was leaving this room in the morning and the sun was there. Later on in the day I walked out and the sun was there. It looked to me like the sun had moved, but I knew better. And that's because of authorities. Or I was taught that Pluto was a planet. You may well have been taught it was not, at least not a major planet anymore. And that information came from authorities. All those examples. So, what are some features of authoritarianism? Some advantages of authoritarian knowledge. Number 1, it is efficient. It's efficient. When my daughter wanted to learn to drive a car, I did not send her out with the car in the street and some keys just to figure it out. No, I hired an authority through AAA to drive with her. Number 2, it's easily accessible. There's no way that I am going to know what's happening in Gaza short of a major plane trip unless I've got a newscaster, some authority telling me what the truth is over there. Number 3, authoritarian information gives us context for today, it gives us context. It gives us a foundation upon which we live. So there was a very interesting hypnosis demonstration that I saw on film. A person was put under hypnosis and told he would not remember any past, have no concept of past. When he came out, he was immobilized, and he sort of got his bearings and moved on. He was placed under hypnosis a second time, at that time told he'd have a past, but no understanding of the future. He was brought out of the trance, and again he was disoriented, but he was able to move forward. The last time he was put under a hypnotic trance and was told he had no concept of past, no concept of future, and was brought out, and he was catatonic. He was immobilized. He could not speak. We depend on knowledge of the past, a sense of the future, understanding of the present that authorities give us in order to move and live our lives. So authoritarianism gives us context for our life. And some reasons to consider this a justified source. Number one, most of the knowledge that we have is authoritarian. That's one good reason. We use it all the time. Most of our knowledge is authoritarian. And further, we have to rely on something, and we know that some of our other sources can be wrong. So why not authorities? Some of our other sources of information can be wrong. So authorities can step in very helpful ways. Sometimes our eyes deceive us, don't they? Here's Leonard, the Lincoln family. Sometimes our eyes deceive us. Okay, reasons not to consider authoritarianism a justified source. Number one, we can be mistaken because we often confuse power and authority. People who are in power, people who have wealth, oftentimes become the knowledgeable authorities, when in fact they may not have any extra knowledge after all. It's no wonder that in every political election, people like Chuck Norris and so forth are up on the stage. Can we rely on them? They're well known, but does that make them true authorities? So we confuse power and authority. And we'll talk a lot about this later in the course. Number two, when you rely on authoritarian information, you're not reasoning for yourself, and that is always a risk. You've given up your own reasoning, your own thinking, your own judgment. You're relying on something, someone else. Number three, it's not a foundational source. When you listen to an authority, you are trusting that that authority got that information from someone else, maybe somebody who did research. When I took my doctor's word that I should take this medicine, I'm hoping my doctor didn't just make that up. I'm hoping my doctor actually got that from a research journal someplace. So authorities are never where knowledge begins. They're not the foundation. And last, the big one, authoritarian information is only as good as its source. It's only as good as its source. People have listened to wrong authorities. Jim Jones, how many hundreds of people, over 900 people killed in Guyana, drinking the poison Kool-Aid that their leader, their authority had told them to drink. So authoritarianism is only as good as its source. The big problem with that kind of knowledge. And now Leonard will talk about intuition.
Our second epistemology is intuition, or intuitionism. Knowledge by means of intuition. So, let's define intuition as, first of all, knowledge that comes from immediate apprehension. Look at those two words, immediate apprehension. So the first word isn't a time word in the sentence. It's not right away, immediate. It means not mediated. There is nothing that comes between the knowledge and the knower. It is direct. It is not mediated by authority or by other epistemologies you're about to hear about. Secondly, immediate apprehension is a big phrase for us, but notice that this knowledge, this intuition, is internal. It comes to me from inside me, not outside like the authoritarianism, but it comes from inside. And it comes independently of any process. There's no scientific method. There's no step-by-step logic here. Instead, it's an all-at-once, immediate apprehension. Now, let's give a couple of examples or characteristics. First of all, when you get an intuition, it's instantaneous. It happens all at once. Secondly, it is personal in the sense that it comes to you and not to anybody else. It comes to one person and only one. So, for instance, I'm sitting on the busy street, I'm on my car, to the radio, on my way to work. Here I come up to a traffic light, and I'm daydreaming, listening to the radio, and I realize that my car is rolling backwards into the car behind me, and I hit the brake, and nothing happens because it was the car next to me rolling forward. So I had this intuition that was wrong, but it was personal. I had it alone, and it was instantaneous. It's like Archimedes stepping into the bathtub. He says, "Eureka!" I found it. I got it. So intuition is an aha moment. Aha is a great word here to capture intuitionism. Let's use a famous example. In the 1980s, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles was offered a very, very rare statue, a statue of a Greek youth of the early archaic period called a Kouros. Now, to get one in this beautiful condition is almost, well, is unheard of. And it was going to be $10 million. A lot of money in the 80s. And they did all kinds of empirical research. They brought in experts to look at the surface of the marble and such. And they decided, yes, this is good, this is real, this is true, we will buy it. And then they invited Thomas Hoving from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who came out, and the curator at the Getty had it all draped, it wasn't on display yet, and he whipped the drape off of it, and Hoving says, I always, when I first see a word marble, a word pops into my mind. And I pay attention to that word. And he said, the word that came into my mind was fresh. And he realized that's the wrong word. And he said to the Getty, I hope you haven't paid for that. Meaning, it's fake. But he knew that in 2 seconds. It was instantaneous. It was personal. It was individual. It was an aha moment of intuition. Oh, and that example comes from Malcolm Gladwell's book called Blink. Some of you have seen this very famous book. Why can we trust intuitionism? First of all, it's powerful. It strikes us with force. When we have an intuition, it feels right. Secondly, it provides us with explanations that otherwise we don't get. Like Archimedes stepping into the bathtub. He had been trying to solve the problem of how much gold was in the king's crown. And he came to understand displacement by putting his foot into the bathtub. So it solves intellectual problems for us. Like Crick and Watson struggling with the issue of DNA. One of them, I forget which one, had 3 of these 2 intertwined strings. And you realize, oh, it's a double helix. It came to him as an intuition, in this case, in a dream. Solving a scientific problem, question. We use intuition in interpersonal relationships. In the first less than a minute, I know, do I trust you? Do I want to know you? Do I feel comfortable with you? It's immediate. We may decide later that we've changed our mind, but this is very fast. And in some of our big life decisions, we rely on intuition.
You can't trust intuition. Like me in my car at the traffic light, they're wrong sometimes. Like you who met somebody in the last few days here on campus, and you're not sure you trust them. But maybe that's not the right thing to do, or you don't trust them, and later you realize that. So, our intuitions can be mistaken. We could be mistaken in what we have perceived. So there's a danger to intuition. Secondly, and this is a big one for epistemologies, it can't be tested by itself. It cannot be verified by itself. I have an intuition, how do I check it? Well, I have to go to another epistemology to check it. And where does it come from? You don't know. Philosophers and psychologists aren't at all sure where these intuitions come from. The origin is unclear. So that's our second epistemology called intuition. Let's go on to our third, which is empiricism.
So empiricism, this is something that you're all familiar with. Empiricism is defined. This is knowledge that comes from direct sensory experience. It's the five senses: touch, taste, smell, hear. Those are things that come from direct sensory experience, and that is, like I mentioned, empiricism. Now, a couple things to note here. It's an external source, so you're getting information from outside of yourself, which is different from intuitionism, of course. And just a couple of examples. How do you know if the milk is sour? Well, if you're using empiricism, you go and you smell it, or you taste it. How do you know that the ice caps are melting? You go and you measure that yourself. That would be using empiricism as a source of knowledge. Now, there's a couple of additional features of empiricism. One is that it's very democratic. It is open to public scrutiny. You can go and prove somebody else's claim. So if I say that there are 1,262 seats in Cowell's auditorium, you could take that as a source of, or as a bit of knowledge by authority, or you could go and count them yourself, and then that would be in more of an empirical source of knowledge. It is very efficient in many cases. If I want to know what the Last Supper looks like, I can trust an image, or I can trust an authority who tells me it, or I can go and I can look at it myself. Or if I wanted to develop a cancer drug, I could go, I could trust other authorities and people who have reported other experiments, or I could go and do all those same experiences myself. Well, it would be much more efficient to just trust the image that somebody gives me of Leonardo's Last Supper. It would be more efficient for me to take on authority somebody else's results from their experiments and then build on those. So it can be very inefficient because you have to go and do it. You have to go do it all yourself. And the other thing is that many of the other epistemologies actually depend on empiricism for their knowledge. And so if you think an easy example would be one where you're trusting on authority. So when we trusted on authority that they used chemical weapons in Syria, we trusted that those weapons inspectors were giving us the right information, the right knowledge, because they themselves did empirical experiments. They did soil samples, they did tissue samples in order to show that chemical weapons had been used. So even if we take something on authority, empiricism lies behind it. Or to give you another example from intuitionism, so take this sculpture. Thomas Hobbing says that it was his intuition that gave him the insight that this was a fake. But that's not just, he didn't just think that up. It was based on the fact that he had seen many, many, many other examples of toroid, so that he had all of that empirical data in his brain. When he looks at a new statue, he can then judge that it is a fake. That can be, his intuition is based on empiricism. Now, reasons to consider this a justified source of knowledge. One is that we all employ it. We employ it every day. We employ it all the time. Of course, it works. Empiricism empiricism, when we gain knowledge through direct sensory experience, it works. But probably the most important reason to consider it a justified source of knowledge is that it can be verified. Somebody else can go check the data. Somebody else can go check that there are 1,262 seats in Palace Auditorium. I can say that Beth Taylor has 16 red ties, and you can go count them. Is that true? But of course, there are reasons to not consider this a justified source. Empiricism can be mistaken. There are reasons to believe that our sensory data can actually be mistaken. There are such things as our senses can just deceive us, and so it can be that empirical data can be wrong. It also doesn't explain the intangible world, which this is just more of a shortcoming than a reason to consider it or not consider it a justifiable source. But if you think about it, can we actually taste, touch, or feel happiness or justice or equality? Empiricism doesn't really help us understand those things.
Okay, the last one we want to talk about is native. This is knowledge that comes from an inborn universal truth, something that's built into you already. Knowledge that comes from an inborn universal truth. Now, I want you to notice, this is knowledge then that is internal. It comes from inside us. And you should notice now a pairing here. Intuitionism and innatism are both epistemologies that come from inside. Empiricism and authoritarianism are both epistemologies that come from outside. Got that? Now, the difference, though, from intuitionism is that intuitionism, if you remember, what Leonard said was, it's peculiar to the individual. So you have an intuition, she may not. And you may have an intuition and she doesn't. But if you have an innate idea, then so does she, and so does she, and so does she, and so does she, and so on and so on. Everybody has these innate ideas. Let me give you some examples of what we're talking about here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Exactly. We don't need the authority of King George to tell us that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. We don't need King George to tell us that. We don't need an authority. We don't have to go out and make observations and observe to see that all people are created equal. We don't need to observe that empirically. It's not just that I have a hunch and maybe you don't, but it is self-evident. We all know it. Or how about something like, it's wrong to torture innocent children for your own pleasure? You know, there has never been a civilization in the history of the world that thought it was acceptable to torture innocent children for your own pleasure. Now, there are actually some civilizations that thought it was okay to torture children because they thought they weren't innocent. And I actually know of one civilization that said it was acceptable to torture innocent children because you could put the sins of the community on them and then expiate the guilt. But nobody says it's okay to torture innocent children for your own pleasure. Now, my sister still tortured me, and Lord knows I was innocent, but it was wrong. We all know it's wrong. Okay. Now, a couple of additional features of intuitionism. And first, it's had a very checkered history. The problem is that people frequently, because they think something, they will assume everybody else thinks that. And so when they go find another culture that doesn't think something, they think there's something wrong with them. Because clearly everybody knows this. There's a phrase that's often used in philosophy, particularly in England, of course, and it is this. As every English schoolboy knows, which basically means you and me, and I'm not too sure about you. So is that really everybody? It's got a kind of checkered history there. But furthermore, we also have to explain somehow, if we all have this knowledge, how is it that it seems like we don't? If we all know that it's wrong to torture innocent children for our own pleasure, then why do sociopaths do that? Or even let's take our founding documents. You all know the one, you just repeated it to me, and In the Declaration of Independence, there's our founding document that says all persons are created equal. And our other founding document, the Constitution, counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. So which is it? Are all people created equal, or are some of them only 3/5 equal? Right there we got a problem. And this is a problem that nativism has to deal with. How do we explain why people don't seem to share those innate ideas? Now, your first innatist you're going to get will be Plato on Monday, and he has one answer to that. Then we're going to get a Christian innatist, Augustine, who will have a different answer to that. But you have to watch for that. If we all have this knowledge inside us, basically, how come we're all so stupid? Okay. Next, why would we consider this a justified source? This kind of innate knowledge. Well, first off, it's universal. I mean, here, let's try another one. If A is B and B is C, then A is C. You all know that. Now, did somebody teach you that? Not really. You know, I teach logic, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's a crock. You can't teach it. If I have somebody in class who says, I don't get it when I say A is B and B is C, then A is C, I don't get it. I'd say, well, let's see. Okay, so a whale is a mammal is an animal, therefore a whale is an animal. I don't get it. Okay? A house is a human artifact. All human artifacts eventually fall apart, therefore a house will eventually fall apart. I don't get it. Now notice, I'm not teaching it. All I'm doing is giving examples of it, because I can't teach it. I can teach you what follows from it, and I can teach you that it's called hypothetical syllogism and blah, blah, blah. But you can't really teach it because we all know it. And many people would claim that the basic truths of math are like that. And you might say, no, 2 plus 2 equals 4. I learned that empirically. The teacher had these little blocks and put them together. Yeah? Point to the 2. Where'd you get the concept of 2? Come up with that. Didn't you already know that? And yeah, you had to learn the symbols and so on. But once you learned the symbols, didn't you just look at it and go, well, yeah. Once you understood what was being asserted. Of course, we all know that. That's the point. Okay, it's universal. Everybody knows it. And secondly, it provides us with explanations that otherwise would elude us. It provides us with explanations. How is it if good and bad simply mean what society says, kind of cultural relativism? How can a prophet say to a society, you are wrong? How can a Martin Luther King Jr. say, you know, here from the Birmingham jail, I'm going to tell you that what you are doing is wrong and you shouldn't judge a person on the basis of the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And if he says that, and the people hear him, they go, well, he's kind of annoying and obnoxious, but darn it, he's right. How is that possible? How can we explain that if right and wrong is simply whatever society agrees on? If that's true, then society could never be wrong. And yet prophets tell them they're wrong, and the amazing thing is, sometimes they go, yeah, you're right. How is that possible? And atheism would explain it. You're getting through to that innate sense of right and wrong that we all have. And of course, the best examples are those things about which we seem certain. Like the truths of logic or math, and maybe some basic ethical truths. Okay, those are reasons we might consider it a justified source, but there are some reasons that we might not consider this to be legitimate. The first one is, it may just be biases. I already alluded to this. I might say, well, I believe this, so if you don't, there's something wrong with you, or somehow you agree with me, you just don't know it yet. But deep inside you, you know the same thing. That could just be my bias in trying to push it onto you. But the bigger problem is this. There may not be any. We're going to be looking at some figures in this class, particularly one David Hume, who will say there's no such thing. There's absolutely no such thing as innate knowledge. It's a joke. It's all just authority or empiricism or an intuition that got passed around by authority. Something like that. There ain't no such thing. Okay. Stand up and stretch for a second. And then let's talk about what we do with all this.
I'm not doing it. fun and exciting, but like really long hours, craziness. Kids.
Right. But rewarding.
So that's where the information comes from. It comes from authority. That's where the information you get comes from. But what do we do with it? What happens to that information? How do we process it? And there's really two ways this can happen. One possibility is what we will call non-rational. You just accept it and act on it. What's your name? Tori? Hi. My name is David Koresh, but actually I'm Jesus Christ. I need you to come to Waco, Texas and be my 24th wife. Your God told me that you were going to come. So I need you to come with me, okay? Are you going to come with me? No. But I'm Jesus. How can you turn me down? But I told you, I'm Jesus. You have to do what I say. Now, what is she doing right now, other than being terribly freaked out? What is she doing right now? She is not just accepting what I said and acting on it. Now, obviously, 23 other women did. You know about Jacob Koresh and Prince Davidians back in the 70s. You ever read about that? But what she was doing is she was processing that information rationally. Now, she probably didn't think about it in those terms. What's going on in her head right now is, well, first off, I wish you'd go away and pick on somebody else. But secondly, she's sitting there thinking, you know, you don't look like Jesus. You know, I've read the Bible, and it says things about Jesus that just don't match up with what you're doing, having 24 wives. What is that? I mean, she is comparing it to the other things she knows to be true. Maybe she has some innate sense of right and wrong, and I seem to be violating that. That's processing it rationally. Or how about this? I just have a sense that the stock market is going to explode upward tomorrow. So I run out and I buy calls when you think it's going up, and puts when you think it's going down, or whatever. So I buy all these futures and so on because I'm convinced it's going to jump tomorrow. I just have this sense. Okay, that would be processing it non-rationally. Or I could say, I need to observe how the economy is going. I talk to the experts who are looking at it as authority, empiricism, and maybe that intuitive sense, maybe some mathematical truths I know that might be innate. And I come to the conclusion, you know what, that may not be a good idea to put all my savings into calls thinking that the market's going to go up in one day. That may not happen. Okay, so those are two ways that, I gave you some examples there. Here's the way it works. You have 4 origins for our knowledge, right? And we can take that authority and just act on it. Oh, you're Jesus Christ? Great, I'll go with you to Waco and do your 24th life. Because I accept what you said. That would be processing it non-rational. Or you could just have this intuition. The market's going to go up tomorrow. And you go out and buy it. Put all your money into calls and futures because you just believe it. Or you can take that intuition or that authority and you can compare it to the other things you know to be true. And we would call that rational knowledge. The authority, which is what she was doing. She was comparing what I was saying to the things that she knew, other things she knew. And she knew that there was no way I was Jesus and that I would ask for such a thing. Or you take that intuition you have and you compare it to the other things you know to be true and you act rationally on it. Now, this last point's a little tricky here, but innatism and empiricism are only on the rational side. Here's why. If there is such a thing as innatism, it comes kind of pre-processed. It already fits with everything else. And as for empiricism, let's be honest here. What your senses tell you is what your senses tell you. The conclusions you draw from it may be mistaken, but the senses themselves are whatever they give you. So if you go out on Friday night and drink a lot, and then that evening you see a pink elephant running at you, you see a pink elephant running at you. Now, the conclusion you should draw is not get out of the way because this elephant's coming. The conclusion should be, I need to stop drinking, I've got a problem. That should be your conclusion. Okay. Now, the way I've set this up, it kind of sounds like this side is bad and the other side is good. And I don't want to leave you with that impression. We are going to be looking in this class primarily at people who tell us that we should live that way, that we should be rational, compare everything we know to the other things we know to be true. But we will also constantly be looking at a minority report that says, you know what, some of the most important things in life, you have to go this way. Let me give you an example. We have a former colleague who used to be on this team years ago, and he told this great story about how when he was in college, he went to Wheaton, and he was walking out of the building, and he saw this young woman walking into the building, and he was just hit with this intuition. This is the woman I am to marry. Boom. Love at first sight, whatever you want to call it. So he found out from some mutual friends who she was, and got introduced, asked her out on a date, it went well, asked her out again, it went well, asked her out again, it went well, pretty soon they're going steady. And eventually he proposed to her and she said yes. And at that point, he suddenly panicked and thought, what am I doing? I'm a rational human being. I'm going to take this intuition, this is the woman I am to marry, and I'm just going to act on it in a non-rational way? That's crazy. So he talked to people who knew him and knew her and asked their opinion, authority. He observed how they interacted with each other. He compared it to some innate sense of right and wrong that he had, and he came to a conclusion he had to break the engagement. This was just crazy. And in fact, he made up a list of all the reasons why they should get married and why they shouldn't, and there were more on the shouldn't than on the should. So he took her out to dinner, and then took her to a very romantic spot where he was going to break the engagement. I know, creepy, isn't it? So, in fact, I said he even pulled out the sheet. You know, I had this intuition that you're the person to marry, but that's just crazy. I'm a rational person. What am I doing? So I talked to people who knew both of us authority. I observed our interactions. I compared it to these senses I have of what's right and wrong. And I just came to the conclusion I have to break the engagement. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. And she looked at him and she said, well, don't be ridiculous. Of course we're going to get married. And they did. That would be a great example of non-rational knowledge. Now, the story doesn't end there. It's now 2 years later. He's in graduate school now. And he's sitting in class, waiting for class to begin, and a young woman, not his wife, somebody else, comes walking in, and he said, I have the exact same intuition. This is the woman I am to marry. He said it felt exactly the same. But there's a problem, of course. He's already married. So, what do? You take that intuition, this is the woman I am to marry, you compare it to what authorities would say. You observe empirically, well, we're having the first year married kinds of issues, you know. His innate sense of right and wrong, and he decided that ultimately he had to reject that intuition. Just decide, I don't know, I'm in heat or something. And so, in that sense, he processed it rationally. So, is there a rule that would tell you when to process rationally and when to process non-rationally? Of course not. Because if there were such a rule, it would be rational, wouldn't it? But sometimes the most important things in life are actually on this side. But we're going to focus on this side. And in particular, we're going to talk about people who believe these three things. And Leonard suggests that you should make this your next tattoo. So, here we go. Number one, the universe is orderly. It isn't chaotic. It may look chaotic, but deep down it really has an order to it. And secondly, you can know that order. And thirdly, the best way to know that order is by human reason. Anybody who accepts all three of those statements is, by our definition, a rationalist. Plato will agree with that. Aristotle will agree with that. Now, they will disagree strongly with each other on what is the universe, and they will disagree strongly with each other on how it is best known, how to know it, but they both agree the universe is orderly, noble, and noble best by human reason. But we will also see people who will tell us the universe isn't orderly. The only order is the order you provide to it. It doesn't have an inherent order. Or it may be orderly, but you can't know it. Or it may be orderly and you may know it, but the best way is not through reason. It's through authority, maybe scripture or something like that. But anybody who accepts all three of those is a rationalist. And let me just end with this comment. I mentioned earlier I taught this class 115 times. In those 115 times, the first question on the first exam was, state the rationalist credo.
One of the issues that concerns us, and we know concerns you too, is the issue of injustice. That there are people in our society who have less access to resources, who are more likely to be incarcerated, who have less access to education and to health care. And that issue of injustice, of course, concerns us all if we're looking carefully at the world that we live in. Now, in this course, what we're talking about is we're talking about knowing, the issue of how do we know. Traditionally, people have treated those two issues very separately. Injustice, justice, that's an issue over here. Epistemology, how we know, that's an issue over here, and those do not intersect. However, that separation of issues has been challenged by an English philosopher named Amanda Kirker, who's written a book called Epistemic Injustice. And what we have on Friday is an assignment that asks you to read. It's a very brief, a 3-page synopsis that she wrote of the arguments in her book. So we're asking you to read that for Friday. We're asking you also to use that lens of justice to take a look at the issues of knowing that we talk about in this course. And we're asking you for Friday to write your first response on her summary. So here's what those responses look like. Number one, we're asking you for half of the page to write a summary of what it is that she's saying. What is her argument as you understand it? We don't require that people get the arguments right or say them as we would say them. We just ask that you take the ideas seriously and do your best to summarize what you think she's saying. And then in the second half of the reading response or the response, we ask you to reflect on her argument. Now, she talks about two forms of injustice to which we're vulnerable in the process of knowing. So that may help to get through the article. But we're asking you to say whether or not you agree or disagree with what she's arguing. And most important of all, we're asking you to support your agreement or your disagreement. On what basis do you agree? On what basis do you disagree? It's that providing basis or evidence for your argument that is critical thinking and that makes up the very best writing, the very best thinking. So that's what we're asking you to do for Friday. But we put this at the very beginning of the course because we think her argument is a provocative one, and because we think it's up to all of us to bring this lens of justice to the issues in the course. Now, just one more thing. Hang on just one more minute, please. Meredith is going to give you some very important practical information about how actually to submit all these things on Blackboard.
So this is your first of 20 reading responses that you'll do, and all of them are formatted similarly, where you spend half of it summarizing the ideas and then half of it responding. And in each case, we ask you to submit it on Blackboard, and this is how you do it. So all these instructions are in the syllabus, but we wanted to make sure we're all clear on this. So all of your reading responses and field responses should be submitted on Blackboard. When you go to save your essay, you should use this format, where the first two characters, or where the X's appear here, that's your D group number.